Many parents and constituents of the Berkeley County School District still have questions after Deon Jackson was fired by the Berkeley County School Board last week. Today, I talked with one of the board members who voted against firing Deon Jackson, David Barrow, for this edition of Quintin's Close-Ups. And if you haven't already, subscribe to my YouTube channel and like Quintin's Close-Ups on Facebook. Berkeley County School Board member David Barrow, welcome back to Quintin's Close-Ups.
Thank you, Quintin. It's my pleasure. How are you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing great. Yourself?
I'm fine. Thank you.
That's good to hear. Well, there's a lot going on right now within the Berkeley County School District, particularly with the Berkeley County School Board. So let me just jump right into it. This comes from WCSC TV, and this is coming from last week. The Berkeley County School Board voted Tuesday night to part ways with its Superintendent Deon Jackson after 16 months after he was obviously hired for the job. Deon Jackson was fired after a 6-3 vote, that is. Board members Yvonne Bradley, Crystal Wakefall, and yourself voted against the termination. And just in the first few minutes of the new school board meeting, that is, the board decided in a 6-2 vote, that is, to remove you as board chair and replace you with Mac McQuillan. Tell me, when you look back at last week to right now, Mr. David, what goes to your mind?
Well, let me start from the beginning, Quintin. As you know, I was at the time the board chair, and under Policy BA, my responsibilities included the sole responsibility of doing the agenda for the board meetings in concert with the superintendent. There's a provision in the Policy BA that the board chair will add to the agenda any items that 3 or more board members ask to be added to the agenda. That happened, I believe it was on November the 10th, which was Thursday, in which I received a request from 4 board members, Mr. Mac McQuillan, Ms. Sally Wofford, Ms. Kathy Littleton, and Mr. Michael Ramsey, to have several agenda items added to the agenda. The first was the addition of 3 resolutions, which I won't go into now. That's public record. It was discussed. I did add those resolutions. The other was an election of board officers. And then there was another request to have 2 personnel action items added to executive session. I asked for clarity as the board chair to find out exactly what was going to be as part of the personnel action items, and was denied. They refused to let me know exactly what was going to be forthcoming in executive session. As it turns out, we all know that that was the termination of Dr. Richardson and Mr. Jackson. Now, with respect to the election of board officers, let me just stipulate I was not ousted because when I became board chair and the other board members, we changed the policy, or we amended the policy BA to add term limits to the officers. So my term limit was expiring.
Okay.
What I was going to do is have those election of officers the next meeting in December, so that the newly elected and newly appointed and sworn in board members could have an understanding of who they'd like to select. But that did not happen. We had the election of board officers because it was requested. I did not object to that because I was going to do it anyway in the next month. So that's number one. The real problem I have is the way this was done. I believe that Dr. Richardson was terminated, and almost in the same motion, another attorney was hired, Brandon Gaskins, who previously was employed by the district, not as an employee, but as a consultant for a certain rate per hour. And then there was no reason given for the termination of Dr. Richardson. And then the next motion was to terminate, I believe Mr. McQuillan made the motion, seconded by Mr. Henson, I believe, to terminate Mr. Jackson's employment. I asked, if you look, it's very clear that I asked the reason for this, and no answer was provided. There was no reason given for the termination of Superintendent Jackson. And then, of course, they called for the vote, and the vote was 6-3 to terminate Mr. Jackson. The next motion was by Mr. Henson, who is a newly elected board member, who made the motion to hire Dr. Anthony Dixon as superintendent, with the authority to hire a deputy superintendent and to rearrange the cabinet level positions as he desired, without any further action of the board. This is unprecedented. It seems to me that, based upon the fact that Mr. McQuillan has indicated that there was 4 board members that actually spoke and discussed this in advance of Tuesday, the 15th meeting, that he said that it did not constitute a legal meeting. So I'm curious as to if that happened, and I'm also curious as to the other 2 board members that voted to terminate both of our employees, Dr. Richardson and Mr. Jackson. And I wonder if they had any discussion as well, because they were not sworn in. They were newly elected, and some impropriety here. So fast forward, let me just say that that I had a discussion with Mr. Jackson on Sunday the 13th, wherein he called me as board chair. He wanted to let me know, I was still the chair at the time, without any knowledge of what was transpiring. It was a shock to me that Mr. Jackson told me that he'd received a call from Mr. McQuillan, a board, and told him that he was going to be terminated on Tuesday without cause, terminated without cause, and that further questions that he could contact Brandon Gaskins. Now, at that point, Brandon Gaskins had not been hired, and neither had Mr. Jackson been terminated, neither had Dr. Dixon been hired. So it's obvious to me that there was some arrangement to have all of this happen, and it just seems like this was a move, a power move politically, to show that these 6 members had control of the board and could do what they wanted to when they wanted to do it. So let me just also say that Dr. Dixon, in one of his interviews, several of his interviews, has indicated that the timeline was fuzzy and this forth and so on. And but he also stated that he had no discussions with any type of his contractual agreement until after the board named him superintendent. Well, how could that be if he was named superintendent without any prior discussions of his contract? And it is also, it begs the question to answer what I'm about to tell you, because in executive session, Mr. McQuillan stated unequivocally before the board that Dr. Dixon's salary would be $225,000 a year because he has a doctorate. Now, advance of the meeting, this was in executive session before Mr. Jackson and Dr. Richardson were terminated. So how could Mr. McQuillan know the salary of Dr. Dixon unless there was an agreement reached beforehand? Now, I realize this is a situation that people do not recognize, but it is a fact that that is exactly what occurred in executive session. And let me just stipulate here that none of the 6 members that voted to terminate Mr. Jackson and Dr. Richardson had any questions, 0 questions, either in executive session or when the motion was made. So it's obvious to me, now this is my personal opinion, that there were definite conversations and possible meetings that took place in advance of this, and contractual arrangements were discussed. If they weren't discussed, how did Mr. McQuillan tell the board that there was a $225,000 salary for Dr. Dixon? So that dispels, or that puts in jeopardy, Dr. Dixon's statement that he had no contractual discussions until after he was hired.
Whew, let me break it down, Mr. David, because okay, when you look at Dr. Dixon's now obviously his salary, $225,000, should that have been discussed by the board first?
All of it should have been discussed by the board first. In my opinion, Mr. McQuillan violated our policy by contacting the superintendent without the knowledge and consent of other board members, because policy BA is very, very clear. No individual board member can conduct or have any discussions outside of the realm of any type of action that might be taken without the consent of the full board. And as the board chair, I had no knowledge, no official knowledge from Mr. McQuillan or anybody else. The only knowledge I had of what was coming was the conversation that I had with Mr. Jackson, because he notified me on Sunday to find out if I had anything to do with this or had any knowledge of it, and I assured him I did not, as well as the other Miss Bradley, nor Dr. Wigfall. None of us three had any knowledge or any inkling officially until we got into executive session.
So when you got into executive session, Mr. David, what was that like?
Well, it was a discussion. First of all, Mr. McQuillan indicated that Dr. Richardson was going to be terminated, and then told us that Mr. Jackson was going to be terminated. And of course, I had some questions. I asked him for the reason why, and he basically told me and the other board members, as I said in the open session, he said that he's not going to discuss that. He didn't even discuss it in executive session as to the reason why. And I said, I want a reason. I want to know why. And he said that Brandon Gaskins will be addressing this question tonight. And Brandon Gaskins was not there.
No.
And that's when I addressed Mr. McQuillan and said he's not here. And it just seems to me that you're not giving any reason as to the termination of Mr. Jackson. So it begs the question, why? And why did those 6 board members act together, perhaps even before the meeting and certainly during the meeting, without any conversation in the open session, and nobody asking any questions or having any commentary except myself and Dr. Wigfall and Ms. Bradley? So it seems as if this was a done deal in advance of that meeting. And that is improper. I believe it is certainly unethical. And I guess someone will determine lawfully if it was legal.
Mr. David, let me ask you, and this is probably a very relevant question, but when exactly did you get that phone call from former Superintendent Deon Jackson?
As soon as Mr. McQuillan hung up the telephone with Mr. Jackson. Mr. Jackson wanted to know if I had any prior knowledge to this, and he told me that Mr. McQuillan said that he had the votes. He had the votes, and that he would be terminated on Tuesday without cause. And then he indicated to me that Mr. Jackson, if he had any questions, he could ask Mr. Brandon Gaskins. Now, why in this world Mr. Gaskins, who was an attorney, would know the rationale and the reason for terminating the superintendent, God only knows. But he was not even an employee or a person that was going to take over for Dr. Richardson. So all of this, Quintin, is not only confusing, it's frustrating. But I will say this: I believe the truth will be known. I believe that there will be an accountability for the actions of this board.
There's so many questions to unpack here, Mr. David. So, going back to obviously the election, the new officers for the board, did you personally want Mac McQuillan to become chairman?
I didn't have a dog in the fight. Ms. Wofford was the chair prior to my being the chair. She was the chair for almost 4.5 years. To that rationale, we modified policy BA to make certain that there were term limits on the board officers, a 2-year term limit, which meant that you could not serve subsequent terms, consecutive terms, but you could hold another office within the next 2 years, and then subsequent to that, you could become board chair again. So, the fact that there was only one slate of officers that were requested for that, I did not vote. I abstained from that, I believe. So Mr. McQuillan became the chair, Ms. Wofford became the vice chair, and Mr. Ramsey, who was secretary prior, was named secretary. And it's also curious to me, Quintin, going back, and I've looked at your close-ups, and Mr. Ramsey was on 2, 3, 4 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago?
2 weeks ago, yes, sir.
I think about a week before the election.
Right.
You asked him about the evaluation of Mr. Jackson, and
right.
He had glowing remarks. He said that Mr. Jackson had as high a rating as he could possibly give him for a first-year superintendent. But yet, Mr. Ramsey, along with 5 other board members, chose to terminate Mr. Jackson with no reason. So and Mr. Jackson had a proficient first-year evaluation, but which was unanimous consent in the prior board meeting. Every board member agreed that his evaluation was proficient. So it's obvious that with no reason given, there was a reason, but it's hidden. I have no idea, except for the fact that initially, when Mr. Jackson's contract was negotiated, and I read this into the record the other day, that it's a possibility that they feel like that the contract for Mr. Jackson was unconstitutional and unlawful. However, 3 very distinguished education attorneys beg to differ. And I read that from Andrea White of White and Story, 34 years with education law, where she said it is common practice for superintendents and boards to negotiate to multi-year and also supermajority for termination without cause. So if that's their argument, I believe they're barking up the wrong tree, because I don't think it's unconstitutional. I don't think it's unlawful. If it was, Quintin, just a question, why not terminate the contracts of all the other superintendents in this state that have the same provisions in their contract? Because it's common practice as defined by Miss Andrea White, and also confirmed by an extremely prominent education attorney, Mr. David Duff. All of these individuals do not believe that Mr. Jackson's contract, as well as other superintendent contracts, are unlawful or unconstitutional.
And Mr. David, going back to that, why would they get rid of the in-house legal counsel and bring in an outside counsel?
Well, that's a good question to ask them. Dr. Richardson was an employee.
Sure.
She was full-time legal counsel with a salary of $140,000 per year. There were no additional allocations as far as clerical to support her. She did not have a full-time paralegal. She interviewed some people, but she did not employ them. So the question is, why? Because as I stipulated in the meeting the other night, Mr. Gaskins was an attorney, And over the course of the years that he was an attorney, the hourly rate was, I believe, was $375 an hour. And I asked if that was going to be the same contract, and there was no answer. So I don't know what the provisions are in terms of what Mr. Gaskin's hourly rate will be. What I will assure you, they will be substantial. There will be large amounts of money for legal fees. And as I indicated the other day, over that 5-year period or so, that when we had Smith Whitley and Mr. Gaskins representing the school district, it was in excess of $1.6 million, which was approximately $312,000 a year, as opposed to $140 for Dr. Richardson. So, if this is the way the board is conducting business, in what they ran on, a very fiscal conservatism, I'd like to know the definition of fiscal conservatism. So let me just also indicate to you some prior discussions I had with Superintendent Jackson. The public is aware that during the budget cycle, there was a 4% raise that the prior board gave to all employees, as well as $1,000 to classroom teachers. That was a 5-4 vote. That was a 5-4 vote. 4 people that voted against that were the ones who are now on the board, on the other, demanding the superintendent's firing. But let me just say, Mr. Jackson and I, and if you recall, Ashley Smith indicated to the board that there was going to be a substantial increase in the fund balance because of the amount of revenue and also some of the positions that were unfilled. So he and I, Mr. Jackson, were contemplating bringing before the board in December another proposal for all of our employees to receive between a 4 and 5% pay raise. We were going to do that. That was not something that we could do. We were going to recommend to the full board that we consider another 4 to 5% pay raise for all of our employees because of the excess revenue and the fact that our fund balance is upward somewhere in the neighborhood of $118 to $120 million. So I just wanted that for the public and for our employees to know that Mr. Jackson and I were working diligently to try to make sure that we were competitive, and more than competitive, with neighboring counties. And we also wanted them to know that we valued them. We wanted to retain them. We did not want them to leave. And it's just unfortunate. The other thing that I think needs to be pointed out is that we have a policy for hiring and firing. Actually, for hiring, let's talk about that for a second. It's policy GCA. Now, Dr. Dixon was given the authority when he was hired to name a deputy superintendent and also to kind of rearrange the cabinet to his without any board action. But there is a policy in place for the hiring of individuals, particularly in light of deputy superintendent. And it basically calls for the advertising of the position, the interviewing of potential qualified candidates, and it calls for the board knowledge and acceptance of those individuals. That went by the wayside, Quintin. He was authorized by the board in a 6-1 or 6-2 vote. I think one of the board members had left at that time. But and let me just say this. The hiring of Dr. Dixon and Mr. Gaskins occurred on Tuesday night. And Dr. was given the authority to hire a deputy superintendent, which is the position that Mr. Jackson had requested 6 months earlier, but was denied by the board. So how is it that Dr. Dixon can set aside the provisions of the personnel policy, GCA, and arbitrarily hire somebody, and I have no idea what that contract might look like. How can you hire somebody without having discussions on a contract in advance? I don't know of anybody who's ever accepted a job without knowing what the job duties are and what the salary is. But I do know that Dr. Dixon and Dr. Whitley were both in the district office, not district office. They were in the district on Wednesday, the next day. So how can Dr. Dixon advertise for, interview, and offer the position to a person? Let's say that he doesn't do that. Let's just say he thinks he has the autonomy to just name somebody. How is it that within a space of a few hours that a contract can be negotiated with Dr. Whitley and her be in the district the next day? It just seems, it smells, Quintin. It smells, and it's not right, and the public needs to know.
And Mr. David, I know I'm probably getting ahead of myself, but do you have an idea of who Dr. Dixon's deputy superintendent is?
Absolutely, I do. Yeah, the deputy superintendent is Dr. Karen Whitley.
Okay. All righty. And I want to go back to Mr. Dixon because I want to go to that interview that he did with a couple of television stations, because he basically said that the board member, as you mentioned, Mac McQuillan, the chairman, called him the weekend before Tuesday's meeting to see if he's still interested in being superintendent. He says, I was contacted that this could be a possibility. So have you actually had a conversation with Dr. Dixon since he became superintendent?
No, I have requested a copy of his contract.
Sure.
And I have not received that to date.
Do you think you know what's in that contract, being a former chair?
I do not. Okay. I can only speculate. Okay. But I do know that his salary was told to us in executive session.
Right.
I don't know if it's a multi-year contract. I assume that it is. I don't, because it's common practice, as we stipulated earlier, Quintin. You know, you don't have a superintendent or somebody that's going to be in charge of a large district anywhere that's going to work for 1-year contract. I mean, that's just not going to happen. And there are going to be provisions in there for possible terminations with or without cause, and it's just not something that is so easily defined. But it takes some time to negotiate. In negotiating, as I was the board chair, when we negotiated with Mr. Jackson, we were in contact with him and his attorney to work out the details of the contract. That contract was executed by me with I believe it was a 3-year contract, and the starting salary was $215,000 a year. With pay raises accordingly, because he is an employee, reports to the board, but I think he received a 4% increase just like every other employee. So I'm curious as to, I know that by statute and by policy, board members, when requesting information, that they have to be provided. So I don't know what his contract looks like, but I will. I'm not sure exactly what's in it, but let me just say,
yes, sir,
that again, Mr. McQuillan said what his salary was going to be in advance of his hiring.
Right.
So let the public decide for themselves if this was an appropriate way to do business, an appropriate way for the 3rd largest school district in the state of South Carolina to conduct business. We are now a laughing stock, not just locally, but statewide and nationwide, because this is a situation that people don't understand. They know what happened, but they don't know why. But I feel like eventually people will know why. Because the actions of those individuals that I believe acted prematurely and had some discussions in advance of that board meeting, I think they're going to have to answer those questions.
And Mr. David, putting that aside, shouldn't this board's priority be about teacher retention and the students of Berkeley County?
Quintin, thank you very much. That's exactly why Mr. Jackson and the prior board were so involved in making sure that decisions were made in collaboration with school leaders, with teachers, with the teacher forum. All of these, it was a bottom-up approach, not a top-down dictatorship. And Mr. Jackson was and is beloved by the majority of people in this school district, and they are highly, highly motivated and highly upset, Quintin, at the actions of this board, of the majority members of this board.
Mr. David, do you believe, was this swift decision a power play to pay back the 2020 school board?
Was it a power play? Yes. Was it a statement? Yes, absolutely. It was a statement that elections have consequences. We've got the supermajority now, and we're going to do what we want to do, regardless of the consequences, and regardless. I'm not sure, Quintin, that the individuals that did this were fully aware of the blowback, of the frustration and anger that they were going to get as a result of their actions. I don't think they did. I feel like they may have thought that this was a 2 or 3 day news cycle, and it was going to be on news for a little bit and then blow over. That's not going to be the case, Quintin. There are people and there are organizations that are highly upset and motivated to make sure that they know what happened and that it never happens again.
And I know that Dr. Dixon, according to Channel 2, was one of the top 3 finalists when Deon Jackson was ultimately hired as superintendent in July of 2021. Did Dr. Dixon at the time have enough experience to be superintendent?
I would say Dr. Dixon was a very relevant player in the discussion. He was afforded the same opportunities to express what his vision was for the board and for the school district. So I think he was qualified. Okay. He had the experience necessary, but he didn't get the job. And I believe the most qualified person did. And I think that's borne out in the actions of Superintendent Jackson. Let me just point out.
Yes, sir.
Superintendent Jackson was given authority by the board to do several things that most of the public's unaware of, and that was to negotiate land acquisition for schools. He had a tremendous relationship with the land developers, with the developers, and with the folks. And he actually did something that nobody else was able to do. In the next one, that'll be probably the next school site. Right. He got 35 acres of land donated, and also $1,850 for every new home that's going to be built in the next area going to the school board. He also was given the authority to negotiate for the old Black Tom Road site, right, where we purchased, upon his leadership, 47 acres for a minimal amount of $2.35 million, which was incredible. Mr. Jackson was a futuristic leader. He was the kind of person that cared about kids, not to say Dr. Dixon doesn't, don't misinterpret what I'm saying. But why replace a man who in 17 months, he was superintendent since July 1 of last year. How can anybody say that he deserves to be fired because of the work that he's done? And That's why I still wonder what is the actual reason why Mr. Jackson was terminated. And I know that Mr. McQuillan has said that those answers are going to be forthcoming. But I think it's too little too late. They should have already defined that. Now, maybe they're afraid of any litigation. He's indicated that because there could be possible litigation. I don't know that. But the public deserves to know why. They need to know, and they needed to know the night that he was terminated.
And I also found out that when they came up with the cost of the previous lawyer, that they used a period when they had to defend the previous Superintendent Thompson and others in criminal cases. So the cost was highly inflated, and that the new lawyers, $144,000, is a marriage because she has a full staff and secretary and paralegals. So their salaries and benefits need to be added as well, as since an outside firm covers all of that. And it's also worth noting that outside firms were still being hired. So if you could go back to now, go back then to now, would you have asked for audit of all of this?
Asked for what?
An audit.
Well, there's really no need for an audit because I have the invoices. I put the invoices on the table the other night for the 5 years in which Smith Whitley and Brandy Gaskin's firm were employed. So that's public information. Yes. I didn't divulge anything that's not public information. But if someone really wants to snoop and look and see what were the individual charges and so forth, that's public knowledge and up to public scrutiny. So the audit, there's no need for an audit because the invoices speak for themselves.
And Mr. David, I know that there has been obviously we have a new Berkeley County School Board, but do you feel like you're next as far as a target for the Berkeley County School Board as far as you not getting elected in 2024?
That's the furthest thing from my mind, Quintin. I haven't, I'm an at-large candidate, or not member at this point in time, because of the law S-910 that was passed and signed by the governor, which I want to stipulate again, I was not in favor of. I was not in favor of the law. I was not in favor of the amendment. The amendment gave me the opportunity not to have to run for election this year. I opposed that. I opposed Joe Danning's amendment. Joe Jefferson and Mr. Danning and the other, Ms. Matthews, all are aware that I opposed that. Now, I've been criticized as making sweetheart deals for this, so I didn't have to run. That's a bald-faced lie.